Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Commie-puss is back, and once again, his deadly tentacles are everywhere. During the Cold War, the communist octopus represented the evil Muscovite octopus with its Marxist-Leninist communist red tentacles enveloping and strangling the globe. Know your communist enemy, the propaganda posters warned back then. The Osama bin Laden and his bang were a merry band of jihadis were called freedom fighters. Today, bin Laden's devilish band of jihadis are terrorists who hate us for our so-called freedom, and the communist octopus is the good guy, there to protect us so-called freedoms, though through the very same tentacles enveloping and strangling the globe with his all-seeing, now benevolent, but still red eye. Indeed, Commie-puss is the new logo for the U.S. spy satellite launched by the National Reconnaissance Office. Nothing is beyond our reach, warns the propaganda poster. Stacy?
This is supposed to be reassuring. Nothing is beyond our reach. Look at this poster here. This is from the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office. And, you know, nothing is beyond our reach, and the tentacles of the American octopus extends all the way around the Persian Gulf. So we're going to look there at the military operations there and the peak oil there. Solar would be cheaper. U.S. Pentagon has spent $8 trillion to guard Gulf oil. It has cost the United States $8 trillion to provide military security in the Gulf since 1976. According to Roger Stern, a Princeton economist, the U.S. has spent as much on Gulf security as it spent on the entire Cold War with the Soviet Union.
Well, on the octopus logo, I think it's just, kids having a laugh because they hire directly out of MIT and these other universities, Stanford, and these are 20-year-old, 22-year-old hackers, and they see the fun that's been had by Matt Taibbi, for example, who calls the vampire squid to describe Goldman Sachs. And they thought, it'd be fun to make the logo a giant octopus, even though it's been used over the decades to be a depiction of all-encompassing, omnipresent police state or banking jihadis as they're known now. And, as far as the second part, which is the second part?
The $8 trillion we've spent on securing the Gulf oil reserves.
Yeah.
Now, the reason is the Strait of Hormuz. We're trying to protect that. And the argument is looking at the fact that we've spent $8 trillion, which would, of course, pay down half of our national debt in the United States. It's also relying on the fact that Iran itself will be totally irrational madmen without thinking, and that they themselves don't need the income from oil, that they themselves would not suffer from oil being blocked from exiting the Strait of Hormuz. Now, finally, the Department of Defense responded to a Freedom of Information request about actually how much oil, where does the oil go that leaves by the Strait of Hormuz? Where is that oil going to? And why are we spending $8 trillion? Are we getting something back in return? Well, Japan receives 20.1% of the oil that flows through the Strait of Hormuz. China, 14.4%. India, 13.2%. South Korea, 12.9%, and the U.S., 9.8%. So you see, the majority is going to Asia. It's not even coming to the U.S. The U.S. is collecting less than 10% from there. We're paying for 100% of the protection, all those military bases I showed you in the map, the tentacles of the map around the Persian Gulf.
Right, but let's keep in mind the circular nature of the oil business and the global bond business, because Japan has been from time to time the biggest buyer of U.S. government debt. So too China, so too the other countries on your list. And that's the whole petrodollar standard that came in the 1971 era after Nixon closed the gold standard. So there's a quid pro quo, there's a symbiotic relationship, and oil is still an enormously dense substance where you can get enormous BTUs burning off oil, and it's kind of a freak substance if you think about it. And now, unfortunately, the credit cycle has peaked and the peak oil cycle has peaked, and so now we're headed back into a war probably. And I see China and Japan, as I predicted 6 months ago, are starting a hot war, as I knew that they would. Pretty much over exactly what you're just talking about. The credit markets have peaked, oil markets have peaked, so it's World War III. Probably Japan and China will get at it. And as night follows day, when you turn off the oil and credit spigot simultaneously, you're going to get a war. There's no doubt about it.
Well, they do point this out in this article that they're saying, just like with the Roman Empire, it was very difficult to manage the extent, all the edges of empire. And here the U.S. has deployed all of their military resources to one region because they want to protect this oil. As is noted, however, China has noticed that because of that, they've not only ignored Latin America, but also Asia, the Asian region. Major General Xin Zhu, director of China's Navy Information Committee, noted that America is bogged down in the Gulf, and, quote, it will take the United States a fairly long period of time to return to Asia. Anti-terrorist wars will constrain U.S. power. China needs to grasp this strategic opportunity firmly.
Well, yeah, General Xin Zhu is making a good point. The geopolitical nature of trying to support a multi-hundred trillion dollar bond bubble with bond prices at a multi-hundred-year high is going to cost the beneficiaries of that bubble, principally the United States and the United Kingdom, dearly now that we're entering a war. Let's get something straight here. At the end of World War II, America had an enormous debt to GDP, but they had just won a war, and they were set up for the 1950s and the American century. America is now double or triple the indebtedness that it was at the end of World War II, inclusive of all unfunded liabilities, not just their national debt. And they're about to enter a war. They're just starting to enter a war, completely enfeebled and crippled by this debt that's been used to finance this unbelievable wealth transfer from the bottom 99% to the top kleptocratic class of hegemonic psychopaths.
The other point noted about this $8 trillion spent just some military operations defending the Strait of Hormuz to make sure that oil flows through there is that 70% of oil goes to feeding cars for people to drive to Walmart or, Dunkin' Donuts. And it's an absurd expenditure. But when we ever ask the population, well, why don't we build public infrastructure projects instead and get people off of cars? They're like, no, we don't have the money. But they don't seem to care or notice that we spend trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars, $400 billion a year just on the Gulf region alone right now on military operations purely to secure the oil reserves.
Well, this is the magic of the automobile to connote freedom, particularly in American pop culture. The automobile has always been the icon of freedom. I see that Ford Motor Company is going to market a Mustang for the globe so that they can export America's idea of the open road and freedom to places like China, where the air pollution is so thick it's wafting into the lobbies of buildings and people are dropping like flies because of the Mustang, because of Ford Motor Company, environmental holocaust proponent and propagator.
Well, we started the show with Nothing is Beyond Our Reach, this new satellite from the National Reconnaissance Office, except for China, I think. It's like crouching tiger, not so hidden smog. Tweet from Bloomberg News, Shanghai orders cars off roads after pollution soars beyond indexable levels. Shanghai ordered vehicles off the road and factories to cut production after pollution reached hazardous levels as Hong Kong announced plans to introduce an air quality index that assesses health risks from smog. So the U.S. consulate in Shanghai noted that the air pollution index surged past 500 to, quote, beyond index category.
Well, this is where guys like Paul Krugman are homicidal maniacs because they say there's no inflation, and yet the trillions of dollars of money printing go to China where the environmental standards are non-existent, and they create smog that's beyond even the index and is now causing kids under 10 years old to get cancer. So that's, Paul Krugman is responsible for that cancer in that child in China because he's the propagandist who's trying to use the New York Times to convince people that there's no inflation due to this money printing.
But the other thing is, George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer here, was recently in China, and he, from China, berated the Brits for not being more like the Chinese. But here is the true cost of our production model, of outsourcing our pollution, of outsourcing our production and wealth creation over there, is that, all these, stupid environmentalists, as they are called on Fox News in America, introduce these environmental regulations, and because of them, we don't have jobs in America. Well, this is the trade-off, is you either drop dead on the street at 35 years old due to the pollution, or you figure out a smarter way of doing things. You figure a smarter way of controlling the Strait of Hormuz, rather than spending $8 trillion a year there, or spending $8 trillion in pollution costs in China.
Look, the combustion engine became obsolete 80 years ago. The fact that it's being subsidized and kept alive this long is a testament to the lobbying powers of the big oil companies. But George Osborne, if he really wants Britain to be like China, he should reverse the anti-smoking laws and let people smoke all day in pubs, in there all day long, because then you'd have something closer to China. Back in the 1950s, something like 20 to 25% of household income in Britain was spent on cigarettes. So people were puffing themselves like chimneys and, puffing themselves to death. If they want to be like Chinese in Britain, smoke yourself to death, George Osborne. You be like China. Give everyone free cigarettes. Why doesn't Osborne subsidize an airlift or a drop of 1 billion Marlboro cigarettes onto the city of London and all over the UK so that British people can smoke themselves to death so they can be more like their Chinese compatriots?
Well, that's an individual choice. How about on something affecting every single person around you? The Thames is quite clean now. There are actually fish and seahorses growing in there again. So why not allow us to just dump our toxic pollution in there? Because then it would be more cost efficient to make various industrial products here. Steel plants could reemerge along the Thames. As long as we could just dump our toxic waste in there, why not?
Because this is where the Chinese industrialists come to hang out, on the Thames and in the city of London. It's nice and clean for them. It's good for the Chinese. Living standards in the UK are collapsing, according to a recent study.
Well, according to the numbers now from the Office of National Statistics, yes, living standards are dropping at the fastest rate since Victorian times, when, of course, we used to have toxic pollution dumped into the Thames and it was a no-go area.
But not for the Chinese, living in Shoreditch and Mayfair. All right, we gotta go.
I'm gonna go dump some sludge into the Thames.
Stay tuned for the second half, a whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to businessman, investor, commentator, and journalist Liam Halligan of The Telegraph. Liam, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Max, good to be here. Good to see you.
I haven't seen you since...
Even though our ties clash.
Well, I haven't seen you since Kilkenny, where we ripped up the Kilconomics Economics Forum. Do you remember? It was fantastic.
There we were in the southeast of Ireland, the sunny southeast, as the locals call it. What an amazing combination under David McWilliams' directorship. Get together some economists from all over the world and have them chaired by sharp, stand-up Irish comedians. Surely it's only a matter of time before Kilconomics comes to London.
Well, it's fantastic because they popularize economics in a way that the average punter can understand it. So we have you here today to help us get through some of these comments by the Chancellor, George Osborne, who gave his autumn statement last week, and he says it's boom times. But foreign trade and fixed investments are declining. Household debt-fueled consumption is rising. The worst drop in living standards in the UK since the Victorian era. Liam, what's going on?
Well, the first thing to notice about the autumn statement, Max, is that it was late. It wasn't only a winter statement rather than an autumn statement. It was also edged forward in the diary because George Osborne and David Cameron, of course, wanted to go to China in order to raise some new inward investment for the UK. So that just shows you where the balance of power is. But this was always going to be a political triumph for Osborne. He's had the biggest upgrade in growth forecast between fiscal statements for 14 years in this country. What really worries me is that even though, yes, the deficit is falling, the debt in this country is massively spiralling, and we must service all that debt. Also, it's the wrong kind of growth. You know, the estimates for consumption were more than doubled between the budget in March and the autumn statement that we've just heard, while the estimates for fixed investment were slashed. Fixed investment in this country is now going to fall by almost 2.5%, according to the Office for Budget Responsibility. So this is kind of a capitulation cappuccino recovery. There's lots of froth on top. It kind of gives you a quick hit. But where's the beef?
This kind of stood out here. The worst drop in living standards since the Victorian era here in the UK. Now, we've been saying on this show for a while, and I've been reading your columns in the Telegraph, and I know you have been looking into this as well, that you've got this interesting economy here in the UK where it's money printing or debt creation is servicing the very top. But the vast majority of folks here in the UK are experiencing the sharpest drop in living standards since Victorian era. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, of course, here in the UK, the Bank of England has almost quadrupled its balance sheet since 2009. The Federal Reserve's increased its balance sheet under QE almost threefold. Both the big Anglo-Saxon economies are, of course, out-Japanesing the Japanese now. And it seems incredible to me that, yes, we do have this increase in nominal GDP, and we're looking at 1.5% growth for 2013, according to the Office of Budget Responsibility. But, Max, you know, the increase in government borrowing is bigger than the increase in nominal GDP. So, in some senses, the whole GDP increase is just government borrowing. And, of course, a lot of those gilts, almost a third of all outstanding gilts now, but more, of course, at the margin, are bought by the Bank of England using virtually printed money. So in some ways, you know, I'm really glad that the UK growth outlook's looking up. I'm delighted, of course, that unemployment isn't nearly as bad as the recessions of the early 80s and the early 90s that I grew up with. But you've got to worry about the sustainability of this recovery now, given that we are floating in the UK on a wave of printed money. How would our gilts market look if we weren't doing QE, if we hadn't done QE to the extent that we are? And what happens, Max, you know, personal indebted just peaked in this country. It's now at a record high. A lot of this extra consumption is coming out of dis saving and also extra credit, particularly in the run-up to Christmas. What happens when interest rates start crawling upward from their current historic low? And this isn't about the Bank of England moving too early. In the end, if the market wants to impose higher interest rates, the market will impose higher interest rates. There's nothing that any central banker can do about that, whether he's good at ice hockey and looks like a rock star. It doesn't matter. In the end, the market will impose higher interest rates. My concern, and I'm trying not to be a Cassandra, I'm just pointing out the realities that a lot of the mainstream commentators seem to be ignoring. My concern is what happens if households stress test their personal finances at 3, 4, 5% base rates of interest, which then, of course, will kick up in the commercial marketplace where people actually borrow and lend.
So when they talk about living standards falling sharply, you just look at a couple of numbers. As you point out, debt is growing faster than GDP. Another interesting number is that wages are way below even the government's stated inflation rate, which is considerably less than the actual inflation rate if you include things like food and energy. So between those two, having declining wages and
housing,
and you put it all together, and your living standards start to collapse. And so the policy, therefore, from Osborne and crew, you have to ask yourself, are they tone deaf, they don't understand the damage that they're doing, or are they just servicing a few folks to get reelected? I think the answer is self-evident. I want to kind of move on here. The Russian economy, and let's talk about that for a moment. The ministry revised down their economic forecasts for 2013 to 2015. Now, you've lived in Russia, and you're a bit of an expert on the Russian economy.
To the extent that anyone is.
Yeah, I mean, it has been opaque up until recently. You've lived there, you've done business there. So let's get your insight a little bit on what's going on in the Russian economy, because we don't talk about it enough on this show.
Sure. Okay, this is the largest retail market in Europe now. This will be the biggest economy in Europe by the time my kids hit the jobs market, and my oldest daughter is 13. This is structurally a very sound economy if you look at the government balance sheet and household balance sheets. Russia has total sovereign debt of 10% of GDP. So its total debt is pretty much in the ballpark of our annual deficit. We're adding as much each year as they actually have. In net terms, of course, Russia is a net creditor to the world, having defaulted, of course, back in the late 90s. A tremendous turnaround. Basic rate of income tax is 13%. There is a lot of very interesting business going on in Russia, and there's a hell of a lot of foreign direct investment, not least from US firms and also from German firms, though the Brits have been a lot more reticent, I must say. In recent months, of course, Russia has slowed down slightly. It's now looking at 1 to 2% GDP growth this year, as opposed to the sort of 4 or 5% that it's averaged over the last 10 to 15 years. Russia does have an image problem. That's partly externally imposed because a lot of Western people have lots of Cold War hang-ups.
I want to jump in here for a
It's
second.
partly also Russia shooting itself in the foot and not really being diligent enough about trying to polish its reputation and look more open to foreign investors. You know, if you want to start a bank in Russia, it's a lot easier than starting a bank in China or India if you're a foreigner. Two of the top 5 banks in Russia are foreign. Lots of the largest retail chains are foreign, tend to be French and German again, rather than British. It's a lot more open than it looks. It's got an open capital account. I've certainly had really good experiences living there over the years, but it does have to work harder to sell itself.
Well, my perception of the Russian economy is that when oil prices are high, everyone's really happy, and they're not incentivized to change or diversify into other areas economically speaking, because they are very reliant on gas and oil. And then when prices are low, then their feeling is, well, we can't change now because we have to deal with these low prices. So as a result, they stay locked in this petro-driven economy, and they're unwilling to diversify or haven't diversified, although we have now seen a diversification into more of a technology space, and they are doing some great things in the tech space. But talk about the image problem you just mentioned. You know, here we are told from, let's say, the Guardian newspaper about folks like Kordoskovsky, and who's held up as a fellow who's being subjected to all manner of persecution by the Russian government. There is a competing view to this. Can you speak on that?
Sure. Just on the oil point, the Russian stock market isn't the economy. Yes, the stock market, or the index, the main index is dominated by oil and gas stock. The actual stock market isn't. There's a lot of mid and lower tier firms that aren't oil and gas. But oil and gas now is only 16% of the economy. It was 40% back in 2003.
Okay, really?
That's about the same as Norway, yeah? The Russian model is to have, yes, lots of minerals and resources, and currently, you know, we're going from 7 to 9 billion people in the world. I'd rather have the minerals and resources than not have them.
On the retail side, we see remarkable growth as well. Retail. Talk about the retail side.
Sure. Well, you have the largest retail market in Europe, as I said, or almost the largest retail market in Europe by dollar value. It will probably overtake Germany this year. It's already the biggest market in Europe by dollar value for cars, white goods, juice, beverages of all kinds. That's why you have got under the radar so much FDI, so much inward investment. You know, the model is kind of an Australian or a Nordic model. You have the resources, but you have lots and lots of smarts as well, and you move up the value chain. That's clearly what we've been seeing, but of course, most foreign investors who read their FT and The Economist, all they focus on are the equities, and a lot of the equities are focused on oil and gas, but beyond that, there's lots of other investment opportunities. What I'd say about Khodorkovsky is this. The vast majority of Russians are pretty happy that there's been a clampdown on the oligarchs. You know, in the late 90s, Khodorkovsky and some other oligarchs, they basically tried to buy the Duma and prevent punitive tax regimes on oil and gas going through the Duma. In the end, those punitive tax regimes on oil and gas, both foreign companies and domestic companies, did go through. You do have very high taxation on oil exports in Russia. That money has been used largely, of course, some of it's disappeared. This is the real world. This is a nascent capitalist society. But the bulk of that money has been used to build up the third biggest foreign exchange reserves in the world, pay off all the debt in net terms, and build a war chest of macroeconomic stability. Of course, Russia isn't immune to image problems from overseas, but the reality is that Putin was the West's favourite guy in the early 2000s. It was only when he started to impose heavy oil and gas taxation that the Western oil majors got really upset. And he went from being a guy who, you know, George Bush could look into his soul to being public enemy #1.
Let's talk about the deal with Iran. How much does this have to do with peak oil? WikiLeaks diplomatic cables show that the U.S. believes that Saudi oil reserves may be 40% overstated. Is Saudi Arabia just just not that important anymore. We've only got about 20 seconds left.
It does strike me as crazy that Saudi could be pumping 22 million barrels a day from the current 9 or 10 by 2025, yet that's what all the Energy Information Agency and IEA estimates show. Clearly that's not going to happen, so they are overstated.
Liam Halligan, we're out of time. We got to go. Thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
A pleasure and a privilege.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Liam Halligan of thetelegraph.co.uk. If you'd like to get in touch, please tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.